Big ideas in small bites. This is Bite Sized, brought to you by Accenture.
Customer obsession is the best growth strategy, and our Life Trends report identifies 5 global macro trends every year as a window into the interplay between people and their behaviours and attitudes to the world around them. The 2025 Life Trends focus on how individuals and businesses are experiencing one of the most dramatic technology shifts in history with the explosion of generative AI. While this opens up vast new experiences and opportunities, it also raises important questions about what it means to be human and the nature of our relationship with technology. I'm so excited to be joined by Katie Burke from Accenture Song, co-author of the Life Trends report, and Mark Evans, coach, NED, trustee and advisor, to delve into this deeper. Welcome both. There's a really fascinating, quite beautiful contradiction at the heart of them. On the one hand, we're adopting technology faster than ever before. We want it to make our lives easier, more efficient and convenient as consumers and citizens. Yet at the same time, we seem to be rebalancing our behaviours and our attitudes to technology, questioning perhaps more deeply the role that it plays in our lives, how much we can trust it, and even retreating from it to reground ourselves in the social and the physical world. Katie, can you tell us a bit more about the Trends 2025?
We do have 5 trends this year. The first one we have called the cost of hesitation, and it's really examining how hesitation is actually rising up in our digital behaviors as we navigate content and how we navigate e-commerce today. Trust is a big deal at the moment, and convenience has been the big deal for the past 30 years. But trust in what we see, is it real, is it safe, is bubbling up more and more. The second trend we have is the parent trap. We are looking at the role of technology and how we see the world and are thinking and wanting different for our kids. And it feels like a course correction is starting to happen on balancing the goods that it can give us with also the consequences that we've been seeing and feeling for the past few years. So that's what that trend examines. The third trend we have is the impatience economy, and it's where we identify that the role of the crowd, the power of the influencer. This is not just an outfit of the day style influencer. This is things like our health, our finances, the way we navigate everyday services in our lives. The power of the influencer is really moving people away from brands and towards brands. The fourth trend is the dignity of work, which highlights a transactional nature of work has emerged as one of the biggest feelings, if you will, that employees and employers have about work. And there's this mutual benefit of a value exchange that's always been there within work, but it's being frayed. And then finally, the fifth trend is social rewilding, where people are getting out into the world at very local, very individual style approaches and looking for depth and texture, and maybe it's the slow journeys of discovery in places that we had prioritized convenience before. The slow texture is being celebrated, if you will, and people are finding a lot of joy in that. So those are the 5.
Thank you, Katie. There is conflict or contradiction that we see between the different trends, the impatience versus the caution and the course correction, the faster adoption of technology versus that idea of being human and reconnecting with the non-digital. But Mark, we can't talk about these life trends without also considering and talking about AI. We're really seeing it start to impact businesses now. We know it brings new opportunities as well as caution around consumer trust, what it really means for us. What is your advice to business leaders?
Yeah, it's a great question. For me, what comes up there is more so than ever before, the need for businesses and those that represent brands to be voraciously curious and really set yourself the exam question, are you learning fast enough? It doesn't really matter what you know, it's are you learning fast enough? And in that context, if I then turn to AI, I've seen a big shift in 2024 from a philosophy of experimentation, maybe 1 or 2 use cases, to much greater adoption, 3, 4 use cases in any given business. I went to a conference the other week where somebody presented the 44 use cases for Gen AI for marketing, and it was really touching all aspects. And then many people will be familiar with the notion of agentic AI, using agents to do relatively complex tasks, completely rebooting workflows, etc. And then I also heard this notion of artificial capable intelligence, which is about 18 months away, where you can ask an agent to really set up a business from the ground up. In that context, what can businesses do? I think the thread through all of these trends, as Katie's already mentioned, is this notion around trust. And how do I know what to trust? How do I build trust? And my guru on this is a brilliant trends expert called Rachel Botsman, global trust guru. And her definition of trust is a comfortable relationship with the unknown, which I think is quite an interesting definition. And it explains why trust is built in drops very slowly and lost in buckets very quickly, because it's about the brain building up a bias of, I think I know what that person's thinking or doing, or what that brand's thinking or doing, even when I can't see that. It's a bit like back in the day when you're learning maths, show your workings. And I think that's really important for brands, the little touches which remind customers what's the intent of a brand at all times, just so that they can have that shortcut of, I can trust in this brand. Ultimately, when consumers feel they have to guess about the intent of a brand, they're probably not going to buy it.
That's absolutely fascinating. It feels to me that we've all had to be so much more comfortable with the unknown. And so this idea that brands can play a role in helping us be more comfortable is really key.
I was fortunate enough to meet Ray Kurzweil a few years back, who I think is the father of AI in many regards. And he said it's been true of technology since time began. Every technology comes with promise and peril. It was true of fire as a technology, which is the foundation of the society we know today, also kills people. Cars enabling us to travel also kills people. It's also true of AI and all the trends we're seeing. And many of the trends touch on the fact that there's a double-edged sword. And so perhaps some of it comes down to, are you an optimist or are you a pessimist? Can you see the hope and the possibility? But also be aware of the downsides.
And it's interesting because learning from history as well of the promise and the peril, there's also very predictable human behaviors. And it's the social rewilding trend, for example, was almost called modern romanticism. Looking back at the impacts of the Industrial Revolution and the way that, it impacted society and people and work and their lives, there was a rejection of certain aspects of it back to nature, back to, a lot more holistic mindsets back then. So we can learn a lot from history as well on the promise and the peril. But there's also behaviors that are very predictable on people. If it moves too far in one direction, they react back and forth. And I think that that's just very, very human. And that stays the same even as new technologies are introduced.
That's so interesting. It's not the first revolution that the human race has lived through. It probably won't be the last. And it's interesting. There are so many things that we can look back to in history that can help perhaps guide us with how we grapple with some of these questions today.
Exactly.
And when you talk about some of these trends that are coming, artificial capable intelligence, agentic architecture, future trends can sometimes feel quite futuristic, quite distant. But actually, these are trends that are coming that we need to be ready for quickly. Katie, the parent trap does feel like a trend that is gathering pace really quickly. Is that what you expected? How do you see it evolving? And what do you think businesses should be thinking about with regard to that particular trend?
Parents have been living with what we call the unintended consequences of past technology breakthroughs, past promises of a new way to connect with each other. Technology ushers in new possibilities, but new consequences as well. And I think that the parent trap is really looking back at 15 years ago of a technology breakthrough of social and understanding what that means for our kids. We've gone through 15 years of data. We now have data coming in saying the impacts of it. And parents have been watching. The Anxious Generation book came out from Jonathan Haidt. That lit up a complete societal collective action kind of momentum. And it's happening very fast from the ground up with parents organizing. Every WhatsApp group that I am in with my kids on my own, or they're talking about these same things. And then it's coming from the top down with governments. You're starting to see bans in Australia. You're starting to see Sweden consider it. You're starting to see Colombia consider it as well. Different places are trying to figure out what's the right approach to help do better for society. It's going to accelerate in the next year, and it's just one to watch.
Mark, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I think this one really resonates as a parent. And to some extent, I feel like I dodged the bullet because my kid's 19, 22. We all hear that the big tech leaders don't let their kids use their apps that they're responsible for. And then also I'm a trustee for a charity called Onside, a youth work charity, and they just published their 2024 Generation Isolation report, which is pretty hard reading. 76% of young people spend most of their time on their screens. 52% are conscious that they need to reduce it. And I think you have to remember that we are an addictive species. It's all neurochemicals. And addiction is a coping mechanism. And so if we're talking about this world getting ever crazier, we should expect this to get worse rather than better unless there's some action here. And so it's a difficult one for businesses to know what to do with the constant drive towards e-commerce. But this is the one that makes me think and worry most in terms of where we are in the world and relationships and mental health and so on and so forth.
If I may add, when it gets to a level, we hope that the course correction starts to happen, and that course correction will be ideally for the benefit. It will not be without challenges, for sure, but you can also see it as a way that this collective action is going to make a big change, and I think that that's a positive sign, and we should read it as a very positive sign overall.
Thank you. And Mark, what you've said there, I think, is incredibly sobering, but it's really good to sort of think about the potentially positive action that's taking place. I suppose this really demonstrates that tension that we see ever more, which is the tension between the promise and the peril of new technologies. The parent power is perhaps going to spark a much wider dialogue that thinks more deeply about this topic as a whole, and that is a positive thing. Let's think about some of the other trends. So, Mark, there's a clear need to transform the customer and employee proposition to make sure that it's personalised, purposeful, and it has what's called physical texture in the report. Mark, when we last spoke, you talked about texture, and you said a brand is really the sum of the customer's experience. Can you tell us about this?
I pull out Monzo, actually brand of the year for the Marketing Society. And for a disruptor bank, they've understood that it's a multi-sensory thing. So who knew the coral card is the thing which really customers value above all else. The sonic jingle when you make a transaction, who knew? So you've got to look at a brand in a bit of detail, but they're a good one in terms of creating holistic brand experiences with texture. Financial services are waking up to this. Back to the trust point, there's got to be more than just a one-layer relationship. I am just going to divert quickly to dignity of work. What is the fabric of the working relationship post-COVID? And I just don't think anybody's really cracked it. Amazon going to 5 days a week, others holding out and being super flexible. And I think it's still the case that connection and chemistry is built in person, but there's a real reluctance. And I was just, actually, Katie and I were at a dinner with some CMOs the other week, and call out to Louise Butler-Green. She pointed out to me that this is all about self-determination theory. Who knew? And that from a working context, and more generally, we need three things. We need competence, the need to gain mastery of skills and learn; relatedness or connection, the need to experience a sense of belonging; and autonomy, the need to feel in control of one's own behaviours. And those last two, relatedness and autonomy, are massively challenged by the notion of hybrid working, having to balance time. So you mentioned about promise and peril. I think that's true also of this hybrid world. It offers so much in terms of flexibility, but it does really yank the chain of belonging and connection. So that's just one that really catches my eye. I don't think anybody's cracked it.
One thing that we've noticed is that there's a lot of me versus we that's out there. A lot of being separated when you're working from home is very, I'm more productive. I'm doing this, and it goes from top down. This isn't just a junior class, within the workforce. This is me, and this is more convenient for me in my life. But I challenge them as, what's the we? What are we doing to pull the we back together, which might mean a bit of a sacrifice from you for the greater collective? And I think about this a lot because, the junior workforce, when they move into the workforce, they don't know what they don't know. They're moving in, experiencing this as their first experience of work. So you ask them from the survey, what do you desire? And they don't know any different. The more senior workforce, they've been there. They know what's good to kind of pull and train and to role model. And so the question that I don't have an answer, but what's the we? How do we pull the we back in? Because the we is what makes it bigger than yourself. And I think that an organization has to be the sum of all parts, something that's bigger than just the individual. And that's really a challenge today.
I think that's a great call to action. And I think, as a leader myself, the trend around dignity of work does again feel really immediate. And this question of how do we get to a we versus a me kind of mindset, there is a huge amount to think about here. We've just sort of touched the surface of what the life trends are, what they can mean. I think they raise some really tough questions that demand quite deep contemplation from all of us as individuals and as leaders. What is your call to action today, or one of the key takeaways for business leaders? Mark, maybe coming to you first.
Yeah, tough times, for sure, for leaders. I've got to restate what I said before about eternal curiosity goes a long, long way in this ever-changing world. But to link to Katie's point about I think leadership is the biggest challenge. How do leaders lead through this? How do they create that intrinsic motivation to get people to want to give that discretionary effort, which seems to be so hard to access? And so actually my call to action, maybe draw on social rewilding as leaders, because I do a lot of exec coaching, and there's a lot of exhaustion, there's a lot of burnout, there's a lot of anxiety. And I think you've just got to be top of your game, fit to lead through this. And so that would be my main thing, is fix your own oxygen mask first.
Such great advice. Katie?
I think one of my key takeaways to business leaders is just be aware that the technology accelerations that are going on, they offer a lot of promises, and it is a hype cycle. So where do you ground yourself? Where do you see what you believe is right and wrong in the world? All those types of things matter today, especially when it comes to just the acceleration of AI. I do think that it's very complicated. It can offer a lot of productivity and efficiencies within the organization, but it can also make people feel very nervous about their well-being and their future. And I don't think, maybe that goes back to what Mark says, is that it's a leadership challenge, but this isn't just a technical implementation. This is a societal shift, and where do you sit on that? I think that it's just a pause, and to figure out what you believe of as an organization, maybe ground back into your core values. Those things are there for a reason. What does that lead you to? And I just feel like leadership and finding a grounding and anchors as this changes is very important.
And finally, we like to ask all of our guests, would you share with us what is it that you're reading or listening to that's inspiring you or giving you perhaps pause for thought?
So I've just reread The Little Big Things by Henry Fraser. Such an inspiring story of a guy who tragically was paralysed from the neck down on an accident on holiday when he was 17 years old, and has become a world-famous mouth artist and turned his life into an absolute triumph. But it's such a fabulous book about human spirit.
There's a newsletter that I receive, I think it's a couple times a week, but it's called The Honest Broker by a Stanford professor named Ted Gioia. And he's a musician by training, but he also was a CEO of a few tech startups in Silicon Valley. And he writes about culture and creativity and humans. And it's one of the most enjoyable reads, although it's challenging in certain cases too. But I do believe that what he articulates is a sentiment of people and how they feel about creativity, and how technology is sometimes challenging that or sometimes accelerating it. And I think it's something I look forward to every week.
Brilliant. Thank you for sharing. That's it for us for now. Thank you so much, Mark and Katie, for joining me today. It's been really fascinating talking to you both. We've unpacked some really big trends, some really difficult questions. It's clear we are facing into a once-in-a-generation leadership challenge, and it has given me so much to think about as a technology leader. Thank you.